In chapter 14, we've actually dealt with all of these issues in Matthew, but I would like to cover in more depth here, now that we're doing a separate commentary on this chapter, on the actual trial itself. A little bit of background. Every Jewish community of any size had a judgmental group called a Sanhedrin in it. There were 23 members of the Sanhedrin. That way you couldn't have ties. You would have 12 voting for and 11 voting against at the very worst. And Jerusalem, however, had the Great Sanhedrin, which had 71 members. And it was in the front of the Great Sanhedrin that Jesus was tried. There were a bunch of rules, laws, we might say, that were established by the kings for how the Sanhedrin would operate. And it was composed of 71 individuals who were individually judges. They were forbidden to have trials on the day of fasts or feasts. They were forbidden to have trials on the day before or the evening before fasts or feasts. They were forbidden to have trials at night, and they had to have a minimum number of people at the meeting in order to have a quorum or a minimum group that would give an authorized verdict. And I'm not sure on the number on the Sanhedrin, but I would assume it would be at least 23, which was the number that they had to have in the other communities. It might have been more with the case of the Sanhedrin. Usually when you have a quorum, you have more than half. So in this case, they probably would have had 40 as a minimum. They were also forbidden to have a guilty verdict where everybody voted guilty. If everybody voted guilty, that was considered a flawed trial, because there had to be, according to Jewish law, at least one of the judges who was willing to vote that the person might have been innocent. If it was everybody voted he was guilty, that was considered a rigged trial, and the person was automatically found innocent and released. I remember reading an article, multi-page article, many years ago on the trial and the legalities or illegalities of the trial of the Savior in front of the Sanhedrin. And although I don't remember all of the details, I do remember the final conclusion was that the Sanhedrin had violated every single standard by which their laws and their decisions could be considered honorable or true. They had the trial at night. We don't know how many people they had, but it was assumed they didn't have the minimum. They actually went out to try and find witnesses against the Savior, and not just witnesses, but lying witnesses, phony witnesses. And even then, they couldn't get their lying witnesses to coordinate their stories. There was absolutely nothing to convict the Savior of, except at the end of the trial, he was asked if he was, as I recall, if he was the Son of God. And he gave an answer which they interpreted as saying he was, therefore guilty of blasphemy. Now, prior to the time the Romans had come into control of Israel, which was either 60 or 63 BC, 60 or 63 years before the birth of Christ, the Sanhedrin had been capable and authorized under Jewish law to make decisions that people could be killed for. So if they made a decision prior to the Romans coming and they said you were guilty of blasphemy, you could be stoned to death. But once the Romans showed up, the Romans took away that right from the Sanhedrin, and only the Roman governor could decide if somebody had done something that was worthy of death. So here we have the Sanhedrin, who the Caiaphas, the high priest, basically says, what need have we more of witnesses? Well, it would be nice to have somebody who actually accused the person of a crime and have witnesses that actually establish that they did the crime, rather than having the person who basically said, well, you believe I am the Son of God, and then saying, what need do we have more? They couldn't get enough liars, and they couldn't get enough witnesses to prove anything. The very worst thing they could possibly convict the Savior of was blasphemy, and that was not anything that was guilty of death. Not under Roman law, it wasn't. But Caiaphas had troops, temple guards, had the members of the Sanhedrin, so they marched over to see Pontius Pilate and basically accused Jesus, not of blasphemy, which is what they had found him guilty of for themselves, but of being the king of the Jews and of rebellion against Caesar, the Roman authority, which was not tolerated. Pilate investigated that and dismissed it. There's no fault in this me. His kingdom is not of this world. He can't possibly affect Pilate or Caesar, because this is Caesar's world. If he's talking spiritual things, it doesn't matter what he believes. He can believe he can fly. Basically, it doesn't make any difference. That's not a crime. What the Sanhedrin and what the high priest then did was they maneuvered the crowd. They manipulated the crowd so that when Pilate, in a moment of weakness and poor decision-making, offered to let Barabbas go, who was a known murderer, in place of Jesus, whom he assumed they would rather have a non-murderer, a non-threat, as opposed to a murderer who was a threat to the safety of everybody in the community. When the high priest and the scribes basically persuaded the people to cry out to let Barabbas free, Pilate lost control of the situation to the manipulation of the high priest and his henchmen. And the reason he let it go was very, very, very simple. No Roman governor of any province wanted to have an upset in his province with the people, because then the military, the Roman legions, would have to get involved in putting down the rebellion, putting down the disturbance, and the governor would lose out on being governor, lose his privileges, and be humiliated and taken back to Rome and lose his ability to make money as governor. It was a very wealth-generating opportunity. And so he then washed his hands of it, sent Jesus to be scourged, whipped. People died from the whipping. That's how brutal it was. And then to be crucified. Now, when the people cried for Jesus to be crucified, they made a statement that his blood be upon us and upon our children. And I think I made mention of this in Matthew. That when Jerusalem was recaptured by Titus in AD 70 after another Jewish rebellion against the Romans, it wasn't the first, second, or third, if I recall, it was more than that. There are reports that the blood ran knee-deep through parts of Jerusalem. That's a lot of people's blood being spilled. The people called for that, and it happened.